And can I welcome you all to today's meeting of the Public Petitions Committee, and as always can ask everyone to switch off their electronic devices because it does interfere with our sound systems. We've had apologies today from Jackson Carlo, who's attending the Health and Sport Committee, and Cameron Buchanan is in his attendance as his substitute. The next item of business is the round-table discussion on PE 1319 on improving youth football in Scotland. Members of a note by the clerks, paper 1, and a submission from the petitioners. Could I welcome everyone to the meeting and thank you all for coming along today. We've had apologies from Malcolm McGregor, who's an advocate from Compass Chambers, as he's got to be in court today. Can I start by asking if everyone can introduce themselves? My name is David Stewart. I'm a Labour MSP from the Highlands and Islands region. And perhaps I could declare, as always, the fact that I'm a trustee of Inverness Cally Thistle. But obviously any comments I make are purely my own, and I can't speak for my club, otherwise I'm in serious trouble at my next home game. So, Chick?
I'm Chick Brody. I'm SNP MSP for the South of Scotland.
John Murray, County Director, Midlothian Football Club.
Good morning and welcome. It's Anne McTaggart, the MSP for Glasgow.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Scott Robertson, one half of the Realgrassroots. I've come dressed today because I wanted to make the point I'm just a football coach, like tens of thousands of other volunteers across Scotland.
Good morning, Angus MacDonald, MSP for Falkirk East.
Good morning, my name is Willie Smith. I'm the chairman, founder of Holyrood Boys Club in Glasgow and also the co-founder of realgrassroots.co.uk.
Good morning, I'm Cameron Buchanan, Conservative MSP for Midlothian.
Morning, Neil Doncaster, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Professional Football League, which is the newly merged league representing all 42 professional football clubs in Scotland.
Good morning, David Torrance, MSP Kirkcaldy Constituency. I declare a registered interest as a member of the Rafe Trust.
Good morning, I'm Andrew McKinlay. I'm the Director of Football Governance and Regulation at the Scottish Football Association.
Good morning, I'm John Wilson, SNP MSP for Central Scotland.
Thank you, colleagues. So the purpose of the roundtable is to enable everyone here to discuss the issues of training, compensation and contracts involving young players, as raised by the petitions of William Smith and Scott Robertson. Could you just ask, in terms of the contributions, if you can make your contributions through myself, that would be very helpful. And we've got around an hour for this really important discussion. And again, I would like to thank everyone for giving up their really valuable time to be here, because that really helps, I think, the quality of the debate that we will get today. So could I start perhaps by just asking a couple of questions, then I'll ask my colleagues I'll ask some number of questions, and again, if you feel that you're best qualified to answer, just please indicate. The first question is, what changes in policy and law have taken place since the petition was first raised in 2010? And in a typical political way, I'll probably answer my own question by saying, I know that the Bernard ruling of the European Court of Justice, which basically have said that the costs of training young players must not, or the actual transfer fee element, must not exceed the actual costs of training of individual players. Who feels they're best qualified to come in that particular issue? Yes. Mr. McKinlay. Yeah.
Thanks very much. There are a number of areas where we have made changes since the initial petition. We've been involved in quite a number of discussions with both Mr. Smith and Mr. Robertson. One of the main changes that we have made is in relation to the reimbursement of training costs. I think it's important to note that this is set against a backdrop that FIFA, the International Football Federation, require associations to have in place a system to reward clubs for investing in the training and education of players. So it's a mandatory requirement for associations to have that. One issue, I think, in the past was that there were two sets of reimbursement of training costs. One was governed by ourselves, one was governed by the SPL, and the SFL, as it was at that time, just used the same one as us. Some of the figures in there were seen as being fairly random, and it was unclear as to how they had an association with the costs that were actually being spent. So what we did was we undertook an exercise to look at the costs that were spent by clubs in relation to the training and development of players. It became clear to us that there was a clear correlation between what was spent and the star ratings that clubs had in relation to our Club Academy Scotland scheme. Because of that, we've set up a new matrix-type system which looks at basically the higher up you are, the more you've spent, and the more that you would expect to get in relation to the reimbursement of training costs. In tandem with that, we've also brought in 2 new rules, making it quite clear that no rights of compensation that a club may have shall prevent a player from moving to a new club. It was seen in the past that the club that was due the compensation was actually stopping the player from moving to a new club, and we've put in a rule so that a club can't do that. On the limited occasions where we have had issues, I would say in the last 2 years since I've been at the association, this has been sort of less than a handful. We are brought in effectively as mediators. We help with the clubs, with the parents, with the players, to look for a compromise situation to hopefully get the player released to the new club. So that's probably the biggest area. There are other areas, however, where we've also made changes, as the Realgrassroots guys are aware. One of them is in relation to the registration and licensing of team scouts. We brought in new rules around that to put in place a new process so that senior clubs have to register their team scouts. That, I think, has been quite successful. There was also an issue around where players were released from Club Academy Scotland clubs and they seem to go into the ether, so to speak, lost to football. That's not a good thing. So we've again set up something whereby information is passed back to the Scottish Youth Football Association to sometimes reunite those players with the clubs they may have come from originally, or any other club, to hopefully not lose them to football. And one other area where I know there was a significant issue around the fact that players within Club Academy Scotland were not allowed to play for their school teams. The rule has been changed such that they can play for their school teams, but it is still at the discretion of the Club Academy Scotland club. I would say, after having quite a number of discussions with various people involved in that generally clubs do provide support in that area, and many players who are Club Academy Scotland players do still play for their school teams. So that gives you a broad overview of a number of areas where we have made changes in the last couple of years.
Thank you. I think Mr Doncaster wants to come in.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you to Andrew for that helpful exposition of the changes that the SFA have made. We have also made changes. We've been working closely with the Scottish Football Association since the merger last summer. One of the areas where last time when I was here in this room there was concern was over the allegations that players were somehow being auctioned, young players, and that clubs where interest was registered by another club, an acquiring club, were not passing on that information to the young players. So the rules have been changed from this summer, which means that any club wishing to acquire the registration of an amateur young player registers that interest with us, the league, and we pass that interest on to the player and his parents. So the player and his parents then have a choice as to what they do. They are in full possession of all the facts of any clubs that are interested in signing them. And indeed, if that process is followed, then there is then a prohibition on any inducement being offered either by the club wishing to acquire the player or his current club to offer any inducement to stay or to go.
Thank you for that. Could I bring in either William Smith or Scott Robertson just to perhaps throw their comments in? I think Mr Smith, you're keen.
Things I'd like to say, Convener, first and foremost, it is true to say that the Scottish Football Association have been more than helpful in terms of sitting down with us and talking to us about this issues. Sadly, I cannot say that about the Scottish Professional Football League. They have shown no interest, no enthusiasm to speak to us about any matter in relation to what is very serious issues under their control. We have attended, as Andrew rightly said, several meetings, some of which we're grateful for, were at the invitation of the Scottish Football Association, and we have a good working relationship with them. I cannot say that exists because we've never been invited. However, I do wish to take up the point insofar as this bartering with a 13 or a 14-year-old. Mr Sinclair from Rangers Football Club, supported by Mr McCart from Celtic Football Club, stated in this room, as Mr Doncaster said, about the situation with regards to a young player who was being traded off between two professional football clubs to the highest bidder. And I would ask anybody sitting around this table as a parent, how would you like your son to be in that situation? The rule, insofar as that Mr. Doncaster has just emphasised, is now in place that parents must be informed. It is 4 years since Mr. Sinclair gave that evidence, supported by Mr. McCart, and that's it, just been introduced this summer. I think that reflects the arrogance that is involved in that organisation headed by Mr. Doncaster. The clubs in that are only interested in getting whatever money they can out of a young potential player. That is all they're interested in. Some of them don't even have the facilities to potentially justify the claim for that money. And we are concerned about that incident in particular, and I know that the committee has changed since the first meeting 4 years ago in January, 2010, but the meeting that Mr. Sinclair appeared at 2011 when he gave that evidence. It's important, convener, to mention that we wrote to Mr. Doncaster after that meeting asking him to investigate the credibility of Mr. Sinclair's evidence and Mr. McCart's evidence. He refused to do so, stressing that there had been no breach of rules. And yet he wrote to one of our supporters who helped us with this petition, former MSP Trish Godman. He wrote referring to the Oliver Bernard case, in which he outlined some points in it. What he didn't outline was that the European Court ruling in the Oliver Bernard case said that only the costs could be met. We have profiteering in our game, and it is wrong.
Thank you very much. Could I just say, obviously we're quite tight for time. We've got quite a lot of questions, so politicians are well used, of course, to making speeches, but I would ask perhaps witnesses are a bit shorter in their contributions. That would be useful. Mr. Robertson, did you want to add anything briefly on the points we were making?
Yeah, I'll be as brief as I can, convener. I'm glad to hear, and I'm aware of the changes that the SFA have made. I got a copy of the document. I don't quite understand if you have 16 kids on a training pitch and a coach or two coaches, how it's more expensive for Celtic to do it than it might be for Adrionians, for example. So we have a system where it's calculated for a star 6 rated club. It's £15,000 as the compensation level, but it's clearly less for a 1-star club. I don't get that part. Maybe that can be answered at some point. I'm glad to hear that there's a rule brought in which stops clubs preventing kids from playing football. I wasn't aware of that. What I'm aware of, there's 2 cases that are running just now, and we can maybe come back and get an answer. But you know, there's a kid here that's been in touch with us. He hasn't been playing football since the 25th of June last year. Now, this is a talented player. This is a player that was on professional books, hasn't been able to play football because compensation has not been paid. I've got his player passport printed off in front of me. That's fact. There's another lad, 21st of November last year, hasn't been registered or been playing football because clubs cannot agree on the levels of compensation. It seems to fly in the face, unfortunately, Andrew, from what you've said. So I take a bit of issue with that. And finally, the exit strategy. Yes, the SFA now send an email in spreadsheet form in Excel to the Scottish Youth FA. Last week there was 19 players released. But the Scottish Youth FA don't know what to do with that list and sit on it. So that information is not then sent to clubs, whether it's Musselburgh, Windsor or Hillwood Boys Club. So if we're getting 19 players a week released from professional clubs, they're sitting in a database doing nothing because the Scottish Youth FA don't know, under the Data Protection Act, whether they can send me John Smith, lives in Musselburgh and plays right back. Here's his address and telephone number. So that is not the full answer.
Actually, that obviously I'll try and bring it at a later stage. I think, Mr. Murray, you were wishing to come in?
Yes, I'd like to say regarding the Aberdonians and Celtic thing, I obviously don't understand the criteria around the Club Academy Scotland. Celtic have one of the top academies in Britain, and they employ full-time scouts and coaches. They employ qualified coaches and various other physiotherapists that cost money. Airdrie only does that same criteria. So there's a lot more money paid by Celtic than there is by Hearts. And that's a fact. Celtic and Rangers pay fortunes for their academies, a lot more than any other club. So the compensation is based around the level of sick which they are. So Airdrie might have 4 teams, Celtic might have 6 teams plus development squads, and development under 20 teams. So a lot more people are involved in Celtic and Rangers than most clubs in Scotland, not Britain. Regarding the compensation Mr Sinclair quoted, I think the figure he gave you is actually wrong. I think there's no reason for him to pay that money for any player in Scotland. There's a set figure, and I believe the player went for that figure, not the figure he quoted. I know what Mr Sinclair said, and I was appalled at what he said at the meeting, but I can assure you that I would pay not 1 penny more than training compensation required under legislation for any player in Scotland.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we're not here as lawyers, but I mean, that's my understanding of what the Bernard ruling is identifying, isn't it, as a root cause. I'm conscious my other colleagues have got questions as well, so I'll quickly go to my next question. I suppose asking the sort of very straightforward question is, why is registration for young players required at all? What's the benefit of a young player of being registered? And one of the quotes we got from the briefing for this meeting was that the Age of Legal Capacity Scotland Act 1991 provides that a person under 16 years of age has no legal capacity, subject to exceptions, and generally contracts with minors are voidable. I don't know whether Mr McKinlay or Mr Doncaster wants to say anything on that.
I'll take the second point about the age of legal capacity. At one of the first meetings I had with the Realgrassroots gentleman, the point was made that anyone under 16, it would be unlawful for them to enter into these agreements, and that they said that they had council's opinion to that effect. So I asked if they would share that with me, and they did. Kindly shared Mr McGregor's opinion with me. It's unfortunate he's not with us today, but I can assure you his opinion does not say that it's unlawful. People of that age can enter into contracts. Their parents that enter into them on their behalf. And if there's an issue around the parent entering into a contract that's not in the best interests of the child, then that issue is between the child and the parent. So they are not per se void or voidable. So that's just the legal response to, and that's their own council's opinion.
Thank you for that. Mr Doncaster?
Yeah, I'll take the first part of the question in terms of what's the point of a registration system. Well, it's a record of exactly where young players are, who they're training with, but primarily it also provides the basis for insurance for those players. And we insure the clubs, and we have a system insurance for the league and all of its member clubs. And of course that covers players within those clubs. So there are good legal reasons why there should be a system of registration.
Thank you for that. Mr Murray?
The form that our player signs is the same form the boys club players sign. Exactly the same registration form. It's not a contract. So the forms that my players sign for Hearts are the same forms that Musselburgh Windsor sign and boys club sign. It's exactly the same form. So we can't do it, why can they do it? It's exactly the same form, which is registered legally by the SFA and SPL. So I'd like to know what the difference between their forms and my forms.
Okay, Mr Smith?
I don't know what John Murray knows about boys club football, but it appears to me to be absolutely nothing. The fact is that there are no forums in boys club football where a child signs at 15 years of age for a 1-year registration, and the club that he signs for, my club, Holyrood Boys Club, do not have the right under SYFA rules to continue that player's registration against his wishes. That's the bottom line on that, Mr Murray. So as far as that is concerned, that is completely wrong. The simple fact is, why do we have to, and I would ask Mr Doncaster and Mr McKinlay to explain this, why does a 15-year-old child have to sign a registration document at that age when professional footballers are free of it through Bosman, when the Scottish Junior Football Association from this year have scrapped it? Why is it that we target a 15-year-old child to continue his registration after he completes that?
I'll allow Mr Murray quickly. I could just say as well, I know there's quite strong feelings around this, but I just ask that we try and deal with each other with courtesy. It's quite useful. Yeah, Mr Murray?
There's the same form you sign. And what we say, Bosman applies to players over 23, not 15-year-olds. So players are free in a Bosman at 23-year-old, not under 23. So I'm not aware of it. You know about European rules or registration forms, but that is a fact. Players are free to go with 23 up, not under 23. And that is a fact.
Thank you. Could I just bring in Mr Doncaster and Mr McKinlay about the points raised by Mr Smith?
Happy to endorse what John's response just was, that the Bosman ruling does apply to players over 23. The FIFA system of compensation for training, effectively, which has been endorsed by the ECJ in the Barnard case, makes it clear that compensation for players below the age of 23 is entirely permissible and within European law.
And just to follow on my initial question, but that's where the Bernard ruling comes in, is it? So basically the compensation should reflect the costs by the club of the training.
Well, absolutely, and what we've put in place is a system that aims to do exactly that. And depending upon the star rating of the academy from which the player comes.
Because not everyone around this table will be experts on football, as you gentlemen are. So just so I fully understand this issue, the Bernard ruling states that there can be a compensation if a player leaves, which reflects the star rating of the facility. So Celtic, as we just heard, will have an expensive setup to reflect the size of the club they are. So if a player from Celtic goes from one club to another, the other club must pay a compensation that reflects the actual costs of training that player for Celtic. There's no premium above that.
Exactly, and what I talked about in terms of the changes to our rules this summer effectively prevents any, there was an allegation of auctioning of young players previously. Our rules from this summer prevent that from happening because the player would be alerted by us to any interest in that player, and the compensation sums are set out very clearly in the rules.
Bring in John Wilson before I bring in Ms McKinlay. John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Just on that point, we've got entered into evidence for today's meeting a letter copied to Mr Smith from Vincent Lunny from the Scottish FA, and basically says that the SFA and SPFL have set tariffs. However, there is no penalty if any club decides to breach those tariffs. So do we have tariffs in place that are actually set for, and taking on board Mr Murray's point about the 6-star club versus the 1-star club, if these tariffs are in place, then if we have those tariffs, how can clubs continue to breach those tariffs without any penalties being applied to them?
Mr McKinlay?
I'll take that first. The letter that's referred to is from my colleague, Mr Lunny, who's the compliance officer within the association. This was a matter referred to him in general terms. I think it might have been a referral back to Mr Sinclair's evidence of several years ago that extra money was being paid. There is nothing in our rules specifically to say that if extra money is paid, it's a breach of our rules, because I actually don't understand how extra money can be paid under the new tariff system. It just doesn't. So we don't generally put in rules in place when it can't happen. Mr Doncaster will probably talk further about their new rules, which prevent them from. We have 2 sets of rule books, so that very much touches upon our rules, and I'm sure Mr Doncaster will speak to the SPFL rules.
Mr Doncaster?
It's exactly the same. So within the SPFL, the 42 clubs, any young player going from one club to another club within the 42 is covered by that system, which sets out exactly what the training compensation should be for each size of club. And
if we take a scenario that a club with big pockets says, I really want to sign this young player who's aged 15, the host club will negotiate what the compensation is based on their costs. Now, how does it then work?
The compensation is set out very clearly in the rules as to exactly what is payable. The club, the big club with large pockets you've described, who wishes to acquire that player, would write to us. We would then alert the player and his parents, and he then has a choice as to whether he stays with his existing club or whether he goes at the end of that year to the new club. If he goes, then the compensation is set out in the rules.
So if the large club says to the parents, this is the compensation scheme, because that's laid down in the rules, but we wish to make you another payment to reflect this, can that happen?
That is prohibited by our rules, would be a breach of our rules, and it would be a disciplinary case that we would then bring if we had evidence of a breach.
Can I bring in Chick Brody?
Good morning. Has there been a breach of the rules to your knowledge, and what investigations have you carried out in these circumstances to make sure that the rules are being complied with? Because I have a suspicion.
We're not aware of any breach of our rules, and if anyone has
any... Have you checked?
Well, we have a...
have you checked the payments in total that are made in a circumstance that's just been in terms of additional payments?
Sorry, Mr Brody, I'm not sure I follow what you're suggesting. If we have evidence of any breach of our rules, then we will investigate that. We have no such evidence before us whatsoever. We don't go on fishing expeditions to look for alleged breaches. If people have allegations of wrongdoing, if people have allegations of breaches of our rules, they should bring that evidence to us and we will investigate. We've seen no such evidence.
So you do not enforce any compliance or do any auditing or do any, it's not fishing expedition. We're talking about young men and indeed young girls as will be playing a sport they enjoy. So you do no, what shall we call it, your fishing expeditions to ensure these rules are being complied with.
I'm sorry, I don't follow. If people are alleging that rules have been breached, let's see what that allegation is. Let's see what the evidence is. I have no such evidence in front of me at all.
Okay. Thank you for that. Could I just perhaps move on, because I know there's a number of questions from members of the committee. Could I bring in Cameron Buchanan?
Why do registrations for those under 15 differ from the from players aged 14 and under? I mean, what's the 15-year-old barrier? What's that? Is that arbitrary?
It comes from the clubs. We are a members' organisation, therefore our rules come from obviously the wishes of the clubs. It was very much viewed, a discussion several years ago, that is seen as the crucial age for the development of the players when they reach that 15. Before that, the clubs are happy after 1 year that they can go on, but at that age they feel that they've made a sufficient commitment and therefore they should be allowed to keep the player for those years. That's why there's a difference. Now, John might be able to add to that as well.
What I would say is that young players from 13 to probably 15 or 14 they go through puberty, they do growing pains, they have Osgood slatters, various illnesses, and players through that time deteriorate, their form goes off for a while. We think at 15 most players come through their growth spurt and we can judge them better what their quality of ability is. So we like to make sure that the investment we put there is kept longer, up until 16 or 17. And it's purely the fact that young ages, players go up and down like yo-yos, their quality goes up. They go through. We've had players at the club for 1 year who are injured with Osgood slatters. No. So we protect that player and keep him for another year through injury. We think at 15 we can better assess the quality of that player and try and keep our investment in that player going on a lot longer. And that's basically why it's done.
So 15 is then arbitrary, effectively. It's not a particular rule, it's one that you've imposed or regulated. Yeah, what he says. Yes. I understand. Thank you.
Scott Robertson.
Thank you, Convener. The comment was made that Bosman doesn't apply unless it's a player that's 23 years or older, and we understand that. What we're suggesting is the principle should also apply to young players. And the registration form, Mr Murray's correct, the form is the same, but the rules behind it, the front-facing form is the same, but the rules behind it are different. I'll give you a couple of examples. If a player signs, and he's 13, a registration form for a boys' club, should he decide halfway through, or for family reasons, he wants to leave and move somewhere else, or just that's put upon him by the family moving, he can do so. 28 days, he writes into the Scottish Youth FA. Now, the same registration form, he cannot exit from Adrionians, or Hearts, or Hibs, or Celtic. There is no such get-out clause, if you like. If we move that up to a 15-year-old, and although I hear Andrew and he said he didn't say it was illegal, Malcolm McGregor said the current regime is flawed. It imposes a contractual regime on young players and clubs in which the former are placed in a clear and distinct disadvantage, in which they have no bargaining power and effectively no remedial rights. So if you're 15 and you sign a registration form and you complete that season, that commitment for 1 year, the club, and only the club, can hold you for a second year. The player has no say in it whatsoever. He has no get-out clause. At the end of that second year, if the club wants to keep you for a third year, they have the power and the authority to do that. The player and the parent have no say in that. And there's a number of organisations, whether it's the Scottish Youth FA, Malcolm McGregor for Compass Chambers, Bridge Litigation, FIFPro, retaining players after they've expressed a right to leave after a season is not acceptable, said FIFPro. This infringes fundamental rights. We heard the same from Tam Bailey, the Children's Commissioner. It was reflected in the FIFA Disciplinary Committee when they dealt with Barcelona William Gibbons wrote in and expressed the same point. The Scottish Trade Union Congress, the Scottish Child Law Centre, even Henry McLeish flagged up a duty of care that was absent.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. I'll bring in Mr. Murray, and then if I could bring in Mr. McKinlay.
First of all, any player, the reason why the players go dual age band is 15, 16, is we have the number of players in each squad. So when we get the 15 to go to 17, we reduce the amount of players in the system, which I thought was what you were after in the first place. So if we've squadded 15, 16, 17, we basically would have 48 players in our system, or 54 players. We go on the dual age, but we go on by the C registration, we have the amount of players in the club. So we go from 30, say 44 players to 22 players. So we actually do what you're asking, reduce the amount of players. Plus we have duty of care to all our players. To say that the parent can't leave is wrong. I've let a player go this week at 14 who moved house. So that is up to the individual club. I would be appalled the club keeping a player who moved house. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Regarding your thing about principles, we all have different principles. Clubs work with different principles. I certainly wouldn't keep a player who moved house. And that's my individual club. I can't speak for Rangers or Celtic. But some of the points you're making are completely wrong.
Right, thank you, Mr. Murray. Could I bring in Mr. McKinlay to perhaps look at the points that Mr. Robertson has raised?
Thank you very much. There were a few issues in there. I'll try and pick up on some of them. I may miss some. We're throwing around quite a few analogies and examples. I think we've got to be very careful when we do that, because a lot of them, as lawyers will know, turn very much in the facts and circumstances. Bosman's been thrown around a lot this morning. There is nothing in Bosman to prevent clubs from having one-way options to extend contracts. Bosman is about someone that comes to the end of their contract and has no contract whatsoever. The Barcelona case has just been thrown up. Barcelona case is all about the movement of minors from South America to Spain. I think we're getting ourselves a little bit excited if we look. FIFA have very clear rules on the movement of minors cross-border. This was to do with boys, young boys who were brought from South America to Spain. So I don't think that is an example that we should be using. Family reasons, John Murray has talked about them. Where there have been issues and clubs haven't maybe had the same principles as John has talked about, again, there's been a couple of times when we've been asked to mediate, and generally we can find a situation where we can compromise. We are allowed to cancel a registration if it comes to that. Now, we don't use that lightly, but in scenarios where it's obvious that the club is abusing its position, then we do have the authority to do that.
Ms. Smith, very briefly, because I'm getting a bit short of time with this lots of questions.
Yes. Referred to Mr. Doncaster, the question from Mr. Brodie. Mr. Doncaster said there was absolutely no evidence in that case. That is the extract of evidence from Jim Sinclair, Mr. Doncaster, that you sat and listened to, where a child was traded off against two clubs.
I could just say that, obviously, for the official record, that can't be picked up. Is it possible you could give us a copy of that information, yes, so that we could then...
You have it in the official... Right. It's Jim Sinclair's evidence to this Petitions Committee.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Doncaster was there. He got that evidence. He declared to Mr. Brodie he didn't have any evidence to investigate. We wrote to him and provided him again with all the evidence. He refused to investigate. We passed it on in an official complaint form to Vincent Lunny, the compliance chap from the SFA. Mr. Lunny came back to his right and said, I can't speak. We asked him to interview Mr. Doncaster about Mr. Sinclair's evidence. He refused to do it. We asked him to interview Jimmy Sinclair for Rangers FC. He refused to do that as well. So it shows the lack of cooperation that we've had in that context.
Thank you. Perhaps bring Mr. Doncaster in, since you were mentioned in dispatches. Do you have any comments on that, Mr. Doncaster?
Yeah, I find myself at a loss to understand what this campaign is aiming to achieve. If there is an allegation that rules have been breached, let's understand what rule we think has been breached, and let's see some evidence, because we are not aware of any evidence of any rule having been breached. We are concerned about what was put in front of us when we were here last time, in terms of the allegations about auctioning young players. And as I've already explained this morning, we've put in place a system that ensures that there should be no incentive for that to happen. We will alert any player if there is any interest from him by a club seeking to acquire his registration. If there's an allegation that a rule has been breached in the past, let's see the evidence of that and let's understand what rule we think has been breached.
Murray?
I would like to find out what the figure was that Rangers Celtic paid for that player. Because I am aware that the figure they paid was not the figure that was spoken at this meeting. And there was no need for anyone to pay over the figure that was asked for.
Yeah.
Yes, you can.
Can I just say that we've got quite a lot of other questions, and I'd rather we keep to the broader principles rather than individual players, because it gets, then what happens is that we miss some of the major points and we have to move on. Mr. Brodie, it's your question.
One thing that's always concerned me about, in particular given the state of Scottish football, why we have still two organisations running our sport, how assure you that you're applying the regulations in the same way?
Yeah, Mr. Doncaster.
Virtually, I think there may be one country in Europe where you have a unitary setup of a league and FA working together. Other than that one country, I'm not aware of any other country in Europe that operates that unitary system.
How much in Scotland?
Well, Scotland matches the situation in the vast majority of countries around Europe where you have one league or two leagues and then a governing body. And that separation is very much the case elsewhere in Europe. Our role as a league is to run a fair competition for the 42 members, the professional clubs, and largely to commercialise that and to run the competition for those members. We work hand in hand with the governing body, who live down the corridor from us at Hampden. We cooperate on a daily basis. I see Andrew and his colleagues daily. There is a good level of cooperation, and in fact we're working together, given the separate rule books that we have, to ensure that where there is overlap, where there is rules touching with the same things, we are very, very clear about who takes priority on each of them. So there is an extremely good working relationship, and where there are issues that arise, that are brought to us, we work with the SFA to look at them. And the suggestions that we're not listening, we don't care, that couldn't be further from the truth.
I'm not suggesting you don't listen, don't care, but you've just said that, processes overlap. You walk up and down the corridor talking to each other about, and this is a very serious issue as far as I'm concerned. It's almost, reading this is like reading a Dickensian novel in some cases. Why do we need, particularly where we're looking at youngsters and trying to foster them for the good of football, why do we need two bodies to oversee the compliance and the registration?
Well, there is a single system that's been agreed with the 42 clubs and with the Scottish FA that's now in place that deals with compensation based on star rating of academies. So there's one system.
Okay. Let me just move on to another very... Can you tell me, Ms McKinlay, in terms of the public funds that are distributed by the SFA, what's the audit process on that?
That's probably not my area of remit, Mr. Brodie, I must admit.
If you can't do now, I'm happy to take, for you to write in, but it seems there's a fair amount of public funds going through Sport Scotland to foster young footballers, and yet I don't see any evidence of what the audit process is, where the money goes, how do we follow the money?
What I would say is, having read the evidence from, I think, 2010, when Mr. Doncaster and Mr. Regan and I think the Minister, Ms. Robertson, gave evidence to this committee, that was explored in depth, and they talked about that whole audit process, and Sport Scotland do come in and audit it. I just don't want to pretend that I'm an expert in that area and try and mislead you in any way, but I do think that this committee went over that in depth, and that was explained in depth to the committee previously.
Can I ask both of you then, in terms of the registration, to what extent can a registration be considered, and this obviously depends on the frame of reference of the solicitors that you're discussing with, but to what extent can a registration be considered a contract between the club and the player's parents?
Ms. McKinlay?
Yeah. Football works and it has two separate things. It has a registration form and it has a player contract. And the people we're talking about here do not enter into football player contracts. They enter into registration forms. I think, again, this was rehearsed quite a lot in the 2010, that we can get into legal semantics about what is and what isn't a contract. But certainly football's view is these are registration forms. They are signed by the child and their parent, but they do not sign what football views as football contracts. Those are for professional players.
Mr. Doncaster, do you want to comment?
Nothing I can add to that.
That's just a couple of very brief questions. To what extent are the obligations placed on young players, is there a barrier for them to move to other clubs, particularly in situations, let's say, as we've just heard about someone who's moving away from the local area? I mean, why in these circumstances, given that we're trying to encourage youngsters to enjoy, not be a means of speculation, to what extent do you think the obligations are placed on a young player in terms of that barrier?
Mr Murray touched upon the fact that there are many clubs that don't put that up as a barrier. So even in the middle of the year, if a family moves, then they often will let them go. It's not in the club's best interest to hold on to a player that doesn't want to be there. As I said earlier in response to another question, where there have been issues, less than a handful in my 2 years in the association have been brought to me around this matter. I think only one has been brought to me where a club has refused to let a player go. We have become involved, and we've managed to get to a situation where reaching an amicable compromise and the player has been released. So it's not something that's been brought to my attention on a daily basis that this is happening all the time. If it was, I would be horrified.
You have no evidence?
Not that's been brought to my attention.
Okay.
Mr Murray, did you have a brief question?
Yeah, I would say that when the parents come in to sign the registration form, they're explained with the training compensation, they're explained what happens at the end of the season, they're given reviews during the season about their performance, and every player at the end of the year can leave and go to a boys' club or go anywhere they want. If a club comes to him, no player's unhappy unless someone comes for him. 99% of the players who sign for clubs are happy until maybe a bigger club come for them. And then they have to, the training competition started. But we have a lot of players at the end of the year. Maybe we let maybe 2 players go per age group, for argument's sake. And some of the boys go to another senior club or go back to boys' club. There are very few players leave things of football and don't play football. They either go to a smaller club in the Club Academy Scotland or back to a boys' club. So the idea that the players are lost to the game is absolute nonsense. These boys go and find a level to play at every year.
Thank you. I think Chick Brody had a brief
just
point.
very quickly. I mean, I hear what you say, Mr Murray, and we're all doing the best for the youngsters. And then I heard earlier that in some cases they may not be allowed to play for the schools. Right? So, you know, what we have to recognise, what I read into this is, what we're talking about is speculating about young men and young women wanting to play the game that they wish. That's what it's about. It's not about anything other than pure business speculation and using young people and limiting their ability to do the thing they enjoy most. And for example, saying you can't play school football, I think is an absolute nonsense.
Right. Mr McKinlay?
A big point. What I actually said earlier on was that generally clubs do release players to play for their school teams. Again, there was a lot of discussion about this when it last came before this committee, that there are boys that maybe have played 5, 6, 7 times a week and John will be able to give more information on this for their Club Academy Scotland. I don't think we want to burn out young people either. I think we've got to be very careful with this.
I'm conscious of time, so I need to move on to John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Once again, this issue about registration and the procedures around whether or not how someone would challenge the registration process and whether or not, and Mr McKinlay, you made reference to one challenge that you were aware of in the last 2 years. It's just so that we can be clear if parents and guardians and the young players themselves are aware of the procedures if they want to challenge the registration process and how they would go about that and who would hear that challenge. What body is responsible for hearing the challenge?
If it's our registration rules, which is most likely to be, generally what happens in the first instance is that the parents, where there's an issue, have spoken to one of our members of staff who heads up the whole Club Academy Scotland regime, and in many cases he's able to sort things out before it actually gets into an argument over our regulations. If there's evidence to show, or a belief that there's evidence to show that the regulations have been breached, then that should be sent in to either myself, to the Chief Executive. In either case, we would pass the matter to the Compliance Officer, who would consider whether there had been a breach of the regulations, and if there had been a breach of the regulations, would then take the appropriate action against the club.
I think Mr Smith, you wanted to come in.
But just to enlighten you, like what you said, there's only been a handful of cases since you started with the SFA insofar as disputes were concerned. We've already had a case that was almost going to court until a professional football club withdrew from holding the player on compensation and let him go for nothing. We are currently waiting on word from the Legal Aid Board on behalf of another player to take a club to court over refusal to release him from his contract. So to suggest that there's only been a couple, we've got another one pending, so it's obviously more relevant, Andrew, than you have knowledge of.
Yeah, and just before you come in, just a quick warning. Obviously, we have to be careful about talking about any ongoing legal cases, so I appreciate if members don't mention the name of the case. Mr. McKinlay?
I can only speak to ones that are brought to my attention, obviously. So.
Just while I don't want to go into the individual detail of the court cases involved, it'd be useful if Mr. Smith could give an indication why it was felt necessary to go to the courts rather than go through the procedure that Mr. McKinlay's indicated, and that's to go through the compliance officer and deal with it in that way rather than going to the expense of going to court.
Mr. Wilson, the facts are in both instances the parents exhausted the opportunities with the clubs first. There was no knowledge at parent level of what is available insofar as the next form of approach. Other than Andrew Bryson, the registration secretary, was contacted in both cases and said, that's the rule, that's it, he's registered, they can claim compensation for him, full stop, and these parents have letters to that effect.
Kinley?
Yeah, I can respond to the point that the difference being is that these are probably not where there's a breach of rules. This is where someone actually feels they have to go to court because their belief is that our rules are somehow actually unlawful.
It is a question of going to court, because it is the only way we will get this issue resolved, other than this Parliament, is by going to court. So there's a ruling made on the 15-year-old contract where a club can hold someone against their wishes for 2 years. That's what's going to court.
Mr. Murray?
I would say I've admitted in the last 18 years at Hearts where I've tried to sign a player for a boys club. I've met a lot of aggravation trying to get that done. If some boys club refused to release the player's registration, so he could come to Midlothian Football Club, as of other clubs. So it's not a one-way circle here.